I'm joined by colleagues, Michael, that most of you, I guess, will know very well by now if you have attended the previous sessions, and then by Natalia, that will be presenting the case study for the exercise that we have prepared for you today. So moving on, I would just introduce the housekeeping rules. And again, I guess most of you are familiar with this. Please keep your microphone on mute unless you want to intervene and speak and ask questions. If you have questions, you can also do that in the chat. So if you have questions that come up during the presentation, please do not hesitate to ask them in the chat. I will be monitoring the chat. I will be monitoring the questions, and we can pick them up. We have two opportunities to discuss after the content and then after the case study. Now, we are recording the session today. The recording will be made available, as usual, after the session. Please let us know right in the chat if you have any issue with the recording, but keep in mind that all that we are saying and discussing will be then shared after the session. Now, before we start with the content, I would like to prompt you to provide some inputs on your background using this Mentimeter survey. You see here the link, www or www.menti.com, and then the code to enter. Otherwise, you can use the link in the chat. And if you use your phone, you have the code, the QR code on the screen. This is just to get a bit acquainted with the audience for us to provide better information as we discuss the content and the case study based on whether you work or you're interested in decision-making related to the public sector and government, or local government as opposed to central government, or whether you work with the private sector and look at asset valuation for specific projects that your company may be developing or managing over time, or whether you're interested in the research side, working with academia, or potentially working with civil society and NGOs, looking at the more societal impacts of sustainable transport. This information is useful for us, again, to be able to provide better content, possibly more relevant content, both in the conversation today, but also as a follow-up to these training sessions. Now, with this being said, and please feel free to take your time to respond to this specific short survey, I would go ahead and anticipate or tell you a little bit more of what are the key questions that we will address in this third session of the training. Now, there are three main areas we will cover. First of all, why we need to carry out an integrated valuation for sustainable transport. How can these be useful to inform decision-making about policies, about investments in the context of transport? Then we'll go over the results. So how can the results of this integrated modeling approach that we'll showcase can support the creation of an integrated cost-benefit analysis? And this is a cost-benefit analysis that looks at both the financial dimensions, cash inflows and outflows, as well as the broader societal impacts. And then we'll zoom in a little bit more on financial analysis, meaning that we want to see specifically what is the role of financial analysis when using this broader, more comprehensive systemic approach in supporting decision-making. Now, these three questions build directly on the content that we have seen in the first two sessions. And for those of you that did not join the first two, I would encourage you to go back and see the content that was presented in these two other short 1.5 hours webinars, because we started with the first one looking at what is sustainable transport, and then how have we applied sustainable asset valuation to the transport sector. We used a case study in that case was for non-motorized transport infrastructure, NMT, in India, in Coimbatore. Then in the second session, we started looking more at the methods to quantify the multifaceted indicators, social, economic, and environmental, that help us determine the sustainability of transport. So we look at methodologies like systems thinking, system dynamics, qualitative models related to causal loop diagrams, as well as quantitative models, looking at spatially explicit models with maps, GIS maps, or system dynamics models. We looked at the specific case study of the bus rapid transit system, the BRT, in Bandung, Indonesia. Now, in this specific session, instead, we expand a bit more on the tools, meaning that we see how we can package that systemic analysis with social, economic, and environmental indicators into a cost-benefit analysis. So how do we turn some of the indicators that are typically not economic into economic value so that we can create this more comprehensive and societal cost-benefit analysis? Then we look at the financial component of that, meaning we extend the analysis to see what is the potential for financing projects, depending on, for instance, which type of impacts are tangible, carry a market value, and which ones are relevant for society but do not carry a market value. And in this case, we offer the case study of mass rapid transit in Bogotá, a new project being introduced that will be developed in the coming years. It basically sums up all the content that we have shared in the first two modules, and it presents outcomes for the CBA in more detail as presented in this one module. So with this, I will stop talking. I pass on the word to Michael to start presenting in one go these first, second, and third sections that cover the content of this session 3 of the training on sustainable transport. Michael, over to you.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you everyone for joining. So in the next few sections, as Andrea mentioned, I will demonstrate the added value of integrated valuation, and I will also cover cost-benefit analysis and the financial analysis that we include in our SAVI assessments to assess transport infrastructure. So let's start with cost-benefit analysis and the basics, really. So as many of you know, cost-benefit analysis is a pre-investment tool that can facilitate investment decisions. So since cost and benefits of investments often do not occur at the same time, usually costs precede benefits, the comparison across investors is not straightforward, and that's why we include a cost-benefit analysis for these kind of assessments, basically to provide solid indicators to support decision-making, and also at times, if applicable, to suggest better alternatives for different stakeholders, such as investors, the government, and so on. So in a way, it allows us to compare different options and different projects. Now, what is the difference between a cost-benefit analysis and an integrated cost-benefit analysis? So the latter includes the value of a number of externalities. This can be direct, they can be indirect and induced. And these outcomes, if you will, of an investment are not immediately visible when assessing infrastructure. So these value of externalities are included for the estimation of the extent to which the projects generate societal value. So we're not only looking at financial benefits and costs, but also the benefits and costs to society. This can be relevant at the project level. For example, it can improve predictability, comparability. It can improve assessment of different risks related to the project, and risk mitigation potential. And it can also be related at the policy level in order to uncover the hidden value for sustainable infrastructure, and kind of identify critical synergies or connection that the sustainable infrastructure can have in its context, being a city or a region and so on. So why can integrated valuation support more informed decisions about transport projects or investments or policies? Firstly, they demonstrate a wide range of economic, social, and environmental outcomes that are not immediately visible in conventional transport infrastructure assessments. So we've seen a lot of these examples, but we'll provide more examples later in the session and as part of the case study of the MRT in Bogotá. Secondly, integrated valuations, they help integrate knowledge from different disciplines, for example, from transport, from energy, from urban planning, and so on. And third, they help us to understand the creation of synergies and relationships between different impacts over a long period of time. So this is linked to systems thinking and system dynamics that we talked about in the previous sessions on Tuesday. So it's an important point to understand all the different impacts across social and environmental parameters that a project can have. So here I really brief example that it's based on the case study that we presented in the last session. So it's the BRT system in Bandung in Indonesia. Let's quickly revisit the main added benefits and avoided costs, just to give a brief example. But later we will also provide even more examples when it comes to these added benefits, avoided costs, and externalities overall. So in this case, just a reminder, in terms of added benefits of the BRT project in Bandung, we looked at potential employment creation, any economic benefits in the form of increase in retail revenues or increase in property prices that the BRT project can have in the city, any benefits from physical activity as more people go to stops, they walk more as they take their cars less, and the value of time saved. And also in terms of avoided costs, we can see the cost of CO2 emissions, avoided cost of fuel use, avoided cost of air pollution and noise pollution, avoided cost of traffic accidents, and avoided cost of road maintenance. Again, we'll provide more examples of potential added benefits, avoided costs of different infrastructure projects or policies later in the session. So let's go directly to the cost benefit analysis and the different parts that we consider when we assess an infrastructure project, in this case, a transport project. So the overview of the cost benefit analysis and this part of the session is that we will start with kind of explaining what the cost benefit analysis a little bit more in detail. What is the concept of the integrated cost benefit analysis? And then we start with the direct costs, investment costs, operation and maintenance costs, and then we give different examples and we explain the actual value of the avoided cost and the added benefits and how we estimate them in our assessments. And in the end, we will explain how we compile and interpret an integrated CBA. So basically, overall, this section explains how to use the results of systems modeling and system dynamics that we talked about in the last session to create the end product, in this case, the integrated cost benefit analysis of infrastructure projects. So an integrated CBA provides an overview of the value for money derived from an investment decision. So for this purpose, it includes, as I mentioned earlier, firstly, the costings of the project, so the investment and operation and maintenance costs required for implementation. Then it includes the avoided costs and also the added benefits resulting from a specific transport investment in this case. So a net integrated benefit at the end of the assessment is achieved if avoided costs and added benefit are actually larger or outweigh the investment required for implementation, whereas a net integrated cost emerges if total investment is larger or outweighs avoided costs and added benefits. So we always look for projects that the long-term avoided cost and added benefits are larger than the initial investment costs. Again, a little bit about the integrated cost benefit analysis. It basically combines monetized outputs from different models in concerning the value for money of an investment. It can be a net benefit or a net cost across sectors and actors and over time, and that's why we assess. And basically, rather than judging the performance of an investment according to only the direct costs and benefits related to it, like it has been done in the past. The results of the CBA allow for making a more informed assessment by providing a range of additional indicators. So let's start with the capital costs, which are incurred at the beginning of every project's timeline. No matter the project, it will include capital investment and operation and maintenance costs. So it's basically the cost of implementation of the project relative to the baseline scenario, the business as usual, the scenario where no project is constructed or implemented. So basically, this answers the question, what will be the required capital investment and expected operation and maintenance costs resulting from the implementation of a asset or a policy or some changes in the built environment in this case. So the estimation of investments and operation and maintenance costs is pretty straightforward usually. We need data on the total assets and how much it costs, as well as the cost of operations. And usually this data is available. Usually these costings are the data that are available first after calculating how much a project would cost throughout its lifetime. Again, this includes the capital investments as well as the operation costs. And how it is estimated. So the capital investments are estimated based on capacity installed and capital cost per unit of capacity. And operation maintenance costs are estimated based on capacity installed and the average cost per unit of capacity per year. Operation and maintenance costs are usually they are long-term and continue much later than the construction periods when the capital investment are incurred. So now let's talk about the externalities and the added benefits and the avoided costs and explain what they are and why they are important. So an externality is positive if an impact is beneficial. On the other hand, a negative externality can cause harm. Now, a reduction in a positive externality would be considered a added cost, while a decrease in a negative externality as a result of a project would be considered an avoided cost. You'll see that the avoided costs are very important in our assessment, and many times they actually show the biggest values, the biggest benefits from a particular project. So these externalities are estimated at the economic, social, or environmental level, and they can include examples such as jobs generated, tons of air pollutants emitted, traffic accidents avoided, and so on. And they are usually basically monetized using market or non-market valuation methods. Here you can see some really brief examples from some old assessments that we have undertaken. So in the first case, it was a bicycle sharing system in New Delhi, in a neighborhood of New Delhi. There we looked at main externalities such as avoided cost of air pollution, CO2 emissions, what are the benefits actually of walking and cycling, what are the changes in retail revenues and real estate value, and so on. Another example, you can see the second example here is a BRT in Senegal, in Dakar. Again, we looked at, for example, economic benefits such as employment creation from the BRT, also environmental metrics such as avoided cost of air pollution and CO2 emissions, also time spent in congestion and how it is valued and how is this avoided. And the third example is a road infrastructure in Borneo, in Malaysia. And there, on top of all the economic, let's say, added benefits and avoided costs, we also have some other impacts, for example, from floods. So we try to model impacts from floods. What are the impacts in the local habitat, in biodiversity? If if this kind of impacts tourism or potential long-term tourist benefits in the area, and so on. Just to let you know that these case studies are available online, and they're free to access in case you want to have a deeper look and look at these cases, contexts, added benefits, and avoided costs, and how we valued all these different externalities more in detail. And here, just to delve a little bit deeper and give more examples on added benefits of certain projects. So again, added benefits accrue as a result of positive side effects of an implemented investment, such as, for example, additional labor income, value of time saved, any health benefits, for example, benefits from increased physical activity, any increased in, for example, if there is a railway project, often we have benefits related to trades, to freight trades, income from railway operation. If we are talking about electric vehicles, what is the income generation from the fleet of electric vehicles, and so on. And in terms of avoided costs, again, the definition of avoided cost, it is a reduction in material costs or externalities that is caused by the implementation of the investment. So, for example, we can have, as we mentioned, environmental metrics such as avoided cost of air pollution, CO2 emissions. A lot of transport projects also lead to avoided cost of fuel use as less people use their cars and shift to a non-motorized transport or public transport. Avoided cost of road maintenance, noise pollution, and when we're talking about electric vehicles or policies that potentially subsidize electric vehicles, we also look at the avoided costs of using current fossil fuel-based cars or vehicles in general. And now I will talk a little bit about the financial analysis that we do include in some of our assessments. So what we do is on top of undertaking an analysis to identify all of these added benefits and avoided costs on the economic side, we also include project finance modeling in our assessment, which is an Excel-based analytical tool used to assess the risk reward of lending or investing in a long-term infrastructure project based upon a complex financial structure. So this can depend. All financial evaluation of a project depend upon expected future cash flows generated by activities of a completed project. And in order to analyze this and demonstrate it, we usually build a financial model. So what are these project finance models used for? First, in order to identify the optimal capital structure in the beginning of a project, in order, for example, to determine the optimal debt to equity split used in the financing of a transport project. Secondly, in order to assess the financial viability of a project, so we try to use it and calculate whether the cash flows generated by the project will be sufficient to service any potential debt, as well as generate an attractive risk-adjusted return for equity investors, if there are any. This also sometimes includes the calculation of key performance indicators that are part of the conventional cost-benefit analysis, such as internal rate of return, IRR, and net present value, NPVs. And thirdly, we use project finance models to also calculate the expected return on investment under different operational and risk scenarios. So in order to basically test projects and assess how the expected return changes under certain operational and risk scenarios. So what would happen if there is a change in demand of a particular transport project? What if there are any price increases, any climate impacts, and so on? Now, how we do that at IISD, we use a financial model for Savvy, sustainable asset valuation tool that we use, and we usually built it in Excel. It follows best practices F1, F9 in order to improve the readability and auditability of the model by a third party. So basically, we develop models that are clear and intuitive, so they can be read and understood by everyone. Then the outputs of the system dynamics model are used as inputs in the financial model. System dynamics model basically quantifies and monetizes the relevant economic, social, environmental externalities that are associated with the project. And then we use the data to input it to the financial model to input this data in Excel. And it also defines what scenarios to use in the financial model. So this depends on the assessment and the target audience. So sometimes some of the externalities are included as costs or benefits. So let's explain some key financial indicators. Some of you are probably familiar with these, but I think it's worth going over them really quickly. So the net present value is the difference between the present value of cash inflows of financing costs and the present value of cash outflows. So it's basically used to analyze the profitability of a projected investment or project. It's really helpful when comparing different projects to understand which project has more benefits. The internal rate of return, though this is just an indicator of the profitability prospects of a potential investment. So it's basically the discount rate that makes the NPV of all cash flows from a particular project equal to 0. Then we have the payback period, which is basically the amount of time it takes to recover the cost of an investment. It is basically, simply put, the length of time an investment needs to reach a break-even point. And here we have two different IRRs and NPVs. So in this case, we have the sustainable IRR and the sustainable NPV. The traditional financial indicators of IRR and NPV are modified in order to also account for environmental, social, and economic costs and benefits in the calculations. So a little more on the main components of the project finance models and what is included as inputs. So we have the development costs, also known as capital expenditures. This is most information on when these core costs are spent during the construction phase. We have construction time. So basically, this can be expressed in the number of quarters or years. And the start of the construction time will also show the model starting date. We have the operational expenditure, which includes the fixed and variable costs of operating a project. We have similarly the operations time, also expressed in number of years. Sometimes the construction and operation phases can overlap if the generation capacity is gradually being increased. And we also have the production generation or quantity. So this basically represents the quantity produced when calculating the revenue. And depending on the type of infrastructure, it can be the amount of energy generated, for example, for a wind farm, or the number of cars on a toll road, and so on. So a few more components to present here. Unit price, also an input on our worksheet. It's basically the price variable when calculating the revenue generated. It can be the expected nominal electricity price or the toll for a highway, for example. The senior debt, so this covers all the debt-related financial information, including the size of debt financing used, for example, the interest rate premium on top of the risk-free rate, various financing fees if they are relevant, and so on. We have equity, of course, the amount of initial equity financing and any additional increase needed during construction of a sustainable transport project. And we also have microeconomic data in general, which can include the risk-free interest rate for the currency used in the model, depending on the country that it applies. And yeah, if any currency conversions are required, the relevant exchange rate can also be specified here, and so on. And with this slide, I will stop and welcome any potential questions that you may have before we delve deeper into a case study. An example, it's going to be the mass rapid transit project in Bogotá, which Natalia will present. But if you have any questions so far, please feel free to ask. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael, for the presentation. Very clear from my point of view, but I've heard it many times. So that being said, I do have a couple of questions I can ask also. But let me start with the ones that we have in the chat. So the first one is, can you provide examples of some of the factors that are considered for the sustainable NPV and IRR? So the way I interpret this is what indicators are considered when we look at the sustainable indicators that are not present when we consider only the financial performance. So examples of the externalities that we include in the CBA.
So from what I understand, the examples can be a lot of these added benefits and avoided costs. That can be social, environmental, or economic. And they're usually not visible in the beginning of a project, and they can be long-term. Just to bring back to some of these examples, here a lot of added benefits or avoided costs that we can see here can also be included in the model, and they are not accrued at the beginning of a transport project. Here you can see the added benefits, and here some examples of the avoided costs. Again, some of them can be economic, some of them can be social, some of them can be environmental, or they can overlap, kind of touch upon both. But that's what we try to do with the Saudi methodology, is to account, basically identify and consider as many of these impacts that are relevant to the project as possible. They are usually not included in conventional in transport infrastructure assessments.
Yes, thank you. So I may also add that these are normally the indicators that are not of relevance to the company that builds the project, but they're relevant to the users of the infrastructure. Meaning these are the impacts that may emerge in an indirect or induced way over the 20, 30, 40 years of the infrastructure. So for instance, it's the cost of air pollution if we introduce more fossil fuel use, or the avoided cost of air pollution if we introduce, for instance, electrified transport that uses renewable energy for power generation and so on and so forth. But it may also include the potential improvement in economic activity in a local context. Retail sales may increase if we introduce a pedestrian area. Now, the constructor that builds a project will build it, and once it's done and operational, leaves. It has no specific financial or other interest in the project. But those that make use of that infrastructure will see these potential synergies or avoided costs emerging over time. Now, if someone is interested in the health aspects specifically, we have a lot more that we can share in that area. So we have developed expertise and knowledge in a number of these different areas. I'm going to share 2 links in the chat on the health side, because with ISD, we have developed both the sector guide for human health and well-being for the Green Climate Fund. So this is the guidance document that each project proponent has to follow to account for health impacts for any Green Climate Fund project that is submitted for evaluation. And then we have also collaborated with the World Health Organization, WHO, on a guide for the estimation of the health co-benefits of climate action. Low carbon transport, sustainable transport belongs to these type of interventions for low carbon development. So we have a lot more that we can share. Just let us know if you're interested, and we'll be happy to share more materials along these lines. Then another question that we have received: have we ever come across the need as part of these projects that we talked about, and I would extend it also to other projects, maybe the nature-based ones, to acquire or purchase land? And would that change the cost-benefit analysis? Meaning we would need to add an extra cost into the CBA, into the analysis. Have we come across this? Is it an important type of indicator or not for us? Michael, what do you think?
I think to be completely honest, for the projects that I have been involved, I haven't really seen that. But as you say, I would think that acquiring the land, for example, for restoring a forest or for potential developing carbon offsets, that would be an extra cost that will be borne by us, by the person that will acquire the land. But I don't have any examples. I'm not sure if you have, Andrea, of anything similar to that.
I think it happens from time to time. And also looking at Natalia, but I don't want to spoil anything from the MRT case in Bogotá that we will look at later. But there have been cases with the introduction of new roads, say the highway in the Borneo case, or we look at Central Asia. If there is a need to purchase land that otherwise would be owned by local farmers or other local owners, this is normally considered in the analysis, yes. And it's important because it adds a cost that otherwise, if land is already public, would not emerge. It is possibly one of the reasons why certain projects take long to develop. And one aspect that we started analyzing earlier on, and this comes also in the case of renewable energy for solar power, for wind power when they're ground mounted, is the time it takes to get the project off the ground. That extending that timeline makes so that the cost increases in the meantime before you actually start seeing the benefits. Now, going back to roads, Michael, again, over to you. Natalia, please hold on, because I know that you have a clear answer for this question for the Bogotá case. The question is whether we consider toll fees for users. And I would say expanding it to different types of transport is the price to use the road, so a toll road, the price for using maybe a bus in the bus rapid transit system, or for using the metro in the metro system. I would basically lump all these options together. Do we consider fees for use for this type of sustainable infrastructure in our assessments?
So we do include these fees as revenues as part of the project, which are not part of the added benefits or avoided costs, but they're not part of the investment cost either. So it's almost like an added benefit in this sense. So that if you purchase a ticket as a citizen, you choose to take a bus or a train instead of, for example, using your car to go from A to B, and that's why we basically consider it as a benefit usually, if that's the case.
Okay, thank you. It is a benefit for the project operators when there is a fee to be paid, right? But it represents also the economic valuation of the benefit in terms of time saved and so on and so forth that the population receives. So that's why it can be seen as a benefit both ways, but it's included certainly in the cost benefit analysis. Then there is another question that is a very interesting one. Whether we consider or we observe legal or political benefits that emerge from these projects. And this is connected to the PESTEL methodology: political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environment. So considering all the factors. Could you, Michael, provide some information as to whether we consider these type of dimensions, specifically on the legal and political side, These are the tricky ones in my view. And then I would also ask Natalia to come in and comment on this one, because it's not explicitly mentioned in the case study that will be presented, and maybe you're aware of whether there are some specific consequences that we want to consider emerging from the implementation of the project.
So in my experience in these assessments, we always have some economic, some social, and some environmental benefits or avoided costs. But the legal and political ones are usually, as you said, the tricky ones. I guess if we have a lot of information of the political situation surrounding a specific project or policy in a country, then we can start thinking about how to integrate this cost with this uncertainty. But usually, in my experience, I haven't come across legal or political, let's say, impacts that we integrate with a, let's say we put a financial value to them. I'm not sure if maybe Natalia has had the chance to integrate one of these risks.
Thank you, Michael. Well, not directly, as Andrea mentioned. I don't remember any direct legal benefit or avoided cost, but the legal component, I think, is always present there. So for instance, in the case of Bogotá, some legal aspect to consider is that the company that is developing the system, the metro line, will take the revenues for some years as a concession, and then after the government will take it over. But in the let's say first 20-30 years, it's going to be taken by this company. So that has some legal implications, but in our case is materialized only through either the cost of the project or the revenues that it will generate. For instance, in the case of land acquisition that you have also mentioned and asked about, there are some also legal aspects there, either if a community can be relocated to build a project or not. And in the case of being relocated legally, the company that is developing this project has to ensure that the community is relocated in well conditions, in good conditions. So that's also some of the legal implications that I've seen, and that is represented in different type of costs, such as the cost of purchasing the land, but at the same time, the cost of relocating these people and giving to them the conditions that they had before, for instance. So that's what I can say for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. Yes, the relocation is a very interesting and dynamic topic, not straightforward, not trivial at all, because as Natalia mentioned, it can be planned, but also what we estimate with our assessments is when this is actually forced by the market. Meaning if we introduce a bus rapid transit system, a new metro line, we know that this normally triggers in many contexts the transit-oriented development, meaning we see the area around the stations and the bus stops becoming more desirable because there is easier access to a public service that allows us to cut time, avoid getting stuck in traffic, finding parking, and so on and so forth. So the indirect way in which this happens is when the value of real estate, the rent basically that needs to be paid, increases so much that it pushes away the population that used to live in a certain area because it's becoming too expensive. And so there it's also where there may be complications emerging. Now, that being said, when we work on energy, for instance, on power generation, the political and legal risk, not from a positive point of view, but negative point of view, like a negative risk, comes up all the time. You can think of how much the cost of generating electricity may change if a carbon tax is introduced when we use coal or natural gas. Virtually no impact for renewable energy, but a large impact for the other types of power generation, especially thermal generation. So in these other contexts, for other types of infrastructure, that risk comes up all the time. It comes up very, very often. Now, I have one more question, and I see that one just came up about Colombia, but we'll keep that for later because we have the presentation for Natalia coming up soon, especially on Bogotá. And the last question we have is whether creating such a more systemic, comprehensive societal CBA is very expensive. Because there is that sort of interpretation of the work we do that may be very complicated, require a lot of time, and be very expensive. do you have any information to share on this? Maybe on the time it takes to carry out an assessment, if it's a long time or a short time, also based on the time that it would take to carry out a conventional assessment. So put it this way, in your own work, Michael and Natalia, doing a conventional CBA with only tangible cash inflows and outflows take a lot less time than working on a full CBA that includes the externalities, or is it about the same?
No, I would say naturally a conventional CBA would take less time, but I think the value created is much more than the additional time spent, because it's more time in terms of data collection, some research, also secondary research to understand what are the different impacts, how to integrate them, how to calculate them. So in that sense, it is more time consuming. But at the end, we find out that these benefits are very big compared to, let's say, the metrics that you would find in a conventional assessment. So I think the value created could be at times 4 or 5 times more than what we would spend time to calculate if we didn't basically integrate all these different impacts. So yeah, to answer your question, it does take a little bit more time, but the benefit from that additional time is massive compared to what we would get, and to what extent we would understand the different impacts of a project if you only looked at, let's say, traditional impacts, direct capital costs, operation and maintenance costs, and let's say just revenues. So the added value is big.
Thank you. Natalia, what do you think? Do you agree? Do you have a different perspective?
Yes, no, I agree. I think in general it takes a little bit more time. And in the case, people that knows about this topic is developing it and has a framework already developed, it will take less time. But anyways, it's an additional effort to identify these externalities, especially when they are intangible. Those are the most tricky ones, the ones that sometimes when we talk with the stakeholders, we cannot identify a value for it. And although we mention it, for instance, in the qualitative side of the analysis, in the CLD, causal loop diagram, or in general in the context, we can mention, okay, there is a, for instance, increasing biodiversity can be a benefit, but it's a very difficult externality to measure. So sometimes, of course, we spend an extra time in finding the literature that is correct for this externality, and sometimes we cannot find it, sometimes we find it. It depends on the context of the project. So yeah, certainly it takes more time, but it adds a very interesting point of view that it's currently being used more and more for decision makers and for investors to decide if they want to go with a project or not.
Thank you. Yeah, these are very useful considerations. I would summarize them as follows. Up to now, we have not really used these methodologies extensively. I mean, collectively for decision making, this methodology has not been used extensively. And we are still struggling with sustainability heavily. And so to me, this means that going the cheaper route in this case doesn't pay off, right? Especially when we look at sustainability outcomes. It is worth investing a bit more in taking a more systemic approach early on in the process to carry out an assessment that is more complete. And on the one hand, as Michael said, gives us more value, meaning it allows us to figure out what are the avoided costs that we could generate and figure out if there is a policy to make them tangible, right? Make them meaningful for the local population. But at the same time, it may allow us to find synergies, upsides, potential additional benefit that we did not consider. And missing these avoided costs and other benefits often means that the project just doesn't go ahead. And so we're stuck with projects that may seem cheap upfront, but then don't deliver what we need on the sustainable development side. Now, also to put this into context, for us as a team, having worked on this for almost 4 years, it only takes a matter of days to conceptualize a model that can be used for developing an 80-page report. Then, of course, it takes time to develop the model, to collect the data. but we are not talking about months for a 10-people team. We are talking about a few days and then dedicated tasks being given to one or the other team member, working still in conjunction with one another, in harmony with one another. But it's not a lot more expensive overall or time consuming than a conventional analysis. Now, this is also then linked to one of the other questions that we received. We have applied this approach to large projects, national scale, to small projects within a city center. We looked at neighborhoods to determine what to do in one area as opposed to another area. And so it's sort of the same level of effort, the same level of data that needs to be collected across the board. There are methods to scale up very quickly, but there are also ways to get very deep and very specific on smaller areas. And so we have a lot of flexibility in applying this approach. It's more like a framework than just a single tool. And also then to answer the final question, then we move on with Natalia's presentation. We publish the reports, like the examples you have seen in the chat. They include all the assumptions in a very transparent way. If you're interested in seeing the models, we also have the models that are developed that can be shared. Normally, we share everything with our project counterparts. And here I'm going to add in the chat training materials for the SAVI methodology overall, not just for transport, but the overall approach that we use. You will see that there is a third module in this training program, online materials, that cut across energy, water management, buildings, roads, and so on and so forth, but not the full extent of sustainable transport. In module 3, you have access to one Excel file that can be downloaded. Now, we have evolved with our approach over time, so this is not the very latest version of the model we use as a starting point, but it gives you an idea for how these models can work. And it does include a full potential financial analysis as well, this model. So I would say, let's go ahead and I'll give the word to Natalia to present the specific example for the MRT in Bogotá. And then we'll have a bit more time for questions, for clarifications before the end of the webinar and this third session. Natalia, over to you.
Thank you. Okay. Can you see the screen?
Yes, full screen,
yeah.
Perfectly fine, yes.
Good. So for this last section of the presentation, we would like to show a recent case developed for Bogotá, which is the mass rapid transit system, which in Spanish is called the Metro de Bogotá. So Bogotá currently has a BRT system, a bus rapid transit system, which is called Transmilenio, but still doesn't have a metro. The only city in Colombia that has a metro is Medellin. And it is planned to build elevated as in the Medellin case, not a subway, but an elevated metro. So let's see about this case. So we have that the project consists of building the Metro Line 1, which is a 24-kilometer extension line. That is aimed to be a sustainable and efficient transport mode for the city. This system is expected to accommodate around 1.5 million passengers per day in each direction. It is important in this case that it's going to be allocated within a 1 kilometer distance of most of the users to be able for people to use it. It needs to be close, and it's going to be integrated with the existing bus rapid transit system. So the idea is to integrate these two systems and create more complete sustainable transport system solutions for Bogotá. This project already began in 2020 with initial land preparation and construction of some sections of the system, and it is expected to be operational in 2028. So it's not going to be operational until it's finished completely. And it is planned to cost considering the initial investment around 5 billion USD, sorry. So what are the goals for us for this assessment? First, assess the environmental, social, and economic impacts of MRT infrastructure in Bogotá. Second, quantify the added benefits and avoided costs and direct costs of the MRT. And finally, evaluate the economic and financial performance of this system. Now, what are the indicators that we consider for this cost-benefit analysis? So first, we have the added benefits. Among the added benefits, we have benefits such as the revenues from the MRT operation. So basically, the ticket that people will pay for using that. It will be a revenue for the company that is building the project. Second, employment creation. So employment related to the construction of the system and also to the operation and maintenance of the system. Benefits from physical activity. This is basically related to the additional walking that people will do when they need to go to the metro stations. So here we are considering this additional physical activity that if people uses the system instead of, for instance, cars, they will perform. Also, value of time saved, and this is related to the reduction in travel time that the MRT system will bring compared to cars, for instance, to individual transport modes. Also, we have changes in retail revenues. This is because of the economic and commercial dynamics that the MRT stations generate. We will have additional benefits in the zone for the retailers that are in the area. So people that have shops in the area, because there is more people, there will be a tendency to increase their sales. And for the final added benefit, we have changes in property prices. This is related to the potential increase in the property value of the houses that surround the area that are nearby the metro stations within a certain buffer area that will be benefited and that will be valued when the project is finished. Now, related to the avoided costs. So what is avoiding implementing this MRT system? First, we have air pollution as an avoided cost, meaning that if there is a shift from individual transport modes, specifically cars, to this metro, there will be avoided air pollution from cars. Same with CO2 emissions and fuel use. So less CO2 emissions related to the use of cars, the burn of fossil fuels, and also less fuel use. So people that normally uses the car will save money in fuel and in other type of costs related to the use of these private transport modes. We have also a number of accidents, and this is related to the fact that there will be less cars on the roads, so less potential for accidents in the roads. Also noise pollution associated with cars, and pollution from increased exposure. This is considering that if people is on the streets and they have to walk to the metro station, they can be more exposed to or less exposed to pollution. And finally, we have direct costs, which are the capital cost of the project and the operation and maintaining costs. So we start these assessments usually with a qualitative analysis, which involves the use of causal loop diagrams. In this case, this causal loop diagram is, I'm not going to enter the details of it, but what I want to highlight is that these type of diagrams are useful for us to highlight the different variables that are going to be included then in the quantitative analysis, the ones that we're going to quantify and monetize later, and to understand the dynamics. So here we can see that this diagram highlights the transport shift dynamics. For instance, in this loop R1, we can see the shift from road fleet use, meaning cars, buses, and other road-based transport, versus the massive rapid transport system. So we can see that there is a shift, and also we can see the associated externalities. For instance, CO2 emissions and air pollution, noise pollution, physical activity. So everything that I just mentioned, it's included here. So it shows the externalities, and this is for both road fleet and MRT. So for instance, road fleet will tend to increase fuel use, increase noise pollution, increase CO2 emissions, while the use for MRT will decrease it. So we analyze these dynamics in the CLD. And finally, we identify the indicators, as I mentioned, that are going to be quantified in the mathematical model. So this is our departure point for the next step, which is the model and the CVA analysis. Okay, for this assessment, we consider 3 scenarios. The first scenario is the business as usual scenario, BAU. Then we have the MRT scenario, assuming an 8% shift from private transport to this massive rapid transport system. And then we decided to extend that demand up to 16% to see what happens if the metro system managed to increase the demand, so more people is using it. And we can notice basically the difference in these 2 boxes that I'm highlighting here. So, okay, and these percentages that we can see here are the shares of each of the transport modes that we see here. So the MRT is in this line, as you can see, 8%, 16%, as I just mentioned, according to the scenarios. And the idea is that while this 8% increases from 0 to then 2% in 2008 and finally 8% in 2030, while this is increasing, there is a shift from other transport modes. So for instance, car, you see that from 13.8%, we decrease it to 11%. Same as with the buses. So people will use less buses to use these massive rapid transport systems. So we can see that for the 8% scenario and same for the 16% scenario, but of course, compensating for this 8% extra that we are assuming in this scenario. So for instance, cars in this case go from, well, in this case, from almost 15% to 8.5%. So we can see there also motorcycle is reduced in this scenario, also taxi. So we can see how we play with the transport modes to increase the demand for the MRT. These 2 scenarios are going to be analyzed and result in the next numbers. So this is the integrated CVA already discounted at an 8% rate for the tangible externalities and at a 3.5% for the intangible ones. The units here are billion COP. And we can see that for each scenario, 8% and 16%, we have a low and a high estimate. What does it mean? That we do a sensitivity analysis here. Basically, in some of the externalities, for instance, health impacts, you can see a difference among the low and high estimates, but you cannot see a difference, for instance, for income creation, because in this case, we consider only one, let's say, one monetary value for this, but for the health impacts, we have a low and a high estimate. This is useful for us when the literature gives us options or ranges of values, right? So we are using in the low estimate, for instance, a low value for the cost of air pollution, while for the high estimate, we are using the high value recommended. Basically, what I want you to notice here is that we have 3 sections. The first, the total investments and costs. Then we have the total revenues. And then we have the added benefits and avoided costs. For instance, for the capital costs, one particular assumption that we have for this scenario is that the increase in the demand for the 8% and 16% will increase only the demand, but not the infrastructure. So with the same infrastructure, with the same 24 kilometers of MRT, we have more people using it, basically. That's why the capital cost does not change across the scenarios, for instance. But the operational and maintenance costs do change. You can see that it's almost a double, from 7,000 billion COP to 14,000 billion COP. So you can see that almost a double because we are doubling the demand, the use of the system. Same happens with the total revenues. It is almost a double from similar to the operational maintenance cost, from 7,000 billion COP to 14,000 billion COP. And so these are the, let's say, traditional indicators that we would consider in a traditional cost-benefit analysis. Now, if we consider the added benefits and the avoided costs, we have the next results. And sorry for the noise in the background. There is an ambulance just passing through. Okay, so in relation to the total added benefits, we have the list that I just mentioned before, but in the case of health impacts, we decided to integrate benefits from physical activity, cost of pollution from increased exposure, and health cost of air pollution. So these three are condensed in these health impacts, just for clarification. We can see that the MRT 8% scenario versus the MRT 16% scenario generates also almost double of the benefits, almost. And in some of the cases, the benefits are the same. For instance, the employment creation is the same for both cases. But what changes is the variables that are related to the use of the system. So everything that involves users will be impacted. For instance, health impacts that involve the users that are buying the ticket and going to the metro. Also value of time saved, changes across these scenarios. Retail revenues also changes, and so on. In the case of the avoided costs, we have these four categories, and now we can see this proportion. We can see that the total added benefits are larger than the avoided costs. But overall, when we consider the investments, the revenues, the added benefits, and the avoided costs, we have a net benefit that results in this value that we see here. So, for instance, the low estimate MRT scenario has around 7,000 billion COP net benefits, while the 16% scenario, also low estimate, has around 23,000 billion COP. So we can see the difference when we keep the same infrastructure, but we increase the demand. And this increase in the demand will vary depending on how, for instance, how well developed is the project, and if the project manages to bring this shift dynamic in the transport system of Bogotá. People find it attractive to be used this system. So that's why we propose these two scenarios. Finally, as a summary indicators, we have the benefit to cost ratio that Michael already explained. So this benefit to cost ratio will give us a sense on how much are the benefits and avoided costs if we consider the investments, the capital and operational maintenance costs. So in this case, when we analyze the benefit to cost ratio without considering the externalities, which means we only consider, for instance, the revenues, we find a rate of 0.4, 0.4 as well for this one, and 0.6. This is below 1 and means that the project added benefits and avoided costs are still not relevant for this project. But this is because we are considering only the total revenues in this case for this benefit to cost ratio. But when we consider the sustainable benefit to cost ratio, which accounts for this category total added benefits and total avoided costs. Then we will see that the project has a benefit to cost ratio that is larger than 1. For instance, for the MRT 8%, it's 1.5 and 2.2 for the different scenarios, and for the MRT 16% is 1.9 and 2.9. So what we can see here is that considering all these other benefits and avoided costs makes a difference, but we will see a little bit more about that later. Here in this slide, I just want to show the proportion of each of the externalities that we consider. So we can see here that, well, we have the capital costs, operational and maintaining costs, the revenues, but when it comes to the benefits and avoided costs, we can see that the largest proportion of it comes from the retail revenues, the time saved, and the health impacts. Basically, these three highlight more among the other avoided costs and other benefits. So as I was mentioning, the benefits of the MRT system in Bogotá are significantly higher when we consider these added benefits and avoided costs in this integrated benefit analysis. So integrated these approaches with these intangible externalities, it's important because we include the full range of the economic, social, and environmental benefits and costs. We are considering everything. So in this case, we can see the same numbers that I was showing before in the other table. And we can see that when we account for these externalities, the project is economically viable. And this is considering that not only the company that is building this project is going to receive a benefit, which are the revenues, but the benefits also goes for society and for the government, for the economy, and for the environment. So basically, altogether, we can conclude that this assessment is an evidence of how important it is to include these externalities in an integrated cost-benefit analysis, that this methodology, the SABI methodology, can help make a stronger case for the MRT system in Bogotá, and then can be an example for other MRT systems in other locations, and that some of the benefits that are more relevant for the MRT case in Bogotá are economic benefits, such as increased revenues and employment creation, improved traffic congestion that is translated into time saved and transport efficiency, increases in health benefits and decreasing fatality events related to accidents, and reduced emissions. And that will be all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia, for your presentation. I think one of the key insights from my side is that slide you had presenting the benefit to cost ratio, looking at only the tangible impacts, this one, for instance, yes, and then the impacts with all the externalities. And if I were to be the decision maker, the investor, I would say, well, basically, if the benefit to cost ratio is not above 1, I'm losing money. So I would not make this investment, right? But if I look at the sustainable benefit to cost ratio, that more societal, comprehensive analysis, I would see actually quite a lot of benefit. And so this points us to the next question, and that is, how can we make so that we internalize these extra benefits, right? Or how can we make so that whoever is investing in the project can gain something out of these benefits? If this is not possible, because the reduction of air pollution is widespread and thousands, if not millions of people would benefit from that in large cities, then the only option is to make so that there is a participatory approach to investment, where we invite and involve more stakeholders into the investment to make so that it can be realized. But this is just my own interpretation of the results, and what I find is striking. It's often projects that seem very successful are not implemented just because there is no cash flow to basically justify the investment. So Natalia, questions for you. We have received a couple. So the first one is whether this project is already underway, and whether this analysis was done when considering whether to implement the project, so at the decision-making stage, or to reinforce going ahead with the project after it is approved. And I'll drop you a hint on this one. I would suggest that you explain the two parts of the analysis that we have performed, the sustainable transport strategy and the MRT, to provide a bit more context. Thank you. Over to you.
Oh, yeah. Good, thank you. Yeah, so this project is already going on. There are advances in several streets and so on, but until 2028, it won't be operational as we understand. Of course, this timeline can change based on the, for instance, the government issues. If now we are changing major soon, is in January, so based on the administration, it can be fair, but the plan is that, and it is already going on. Now, it was considered before or after? No, so the project analysis, like the initial, related to the city planning, was developed a while ago, I think 2018 or something like that. Like the idea of creating this MRT system. So we are using it to reinforce, but at the same time, as Andrea mentioned, we are doing this analysis in conjunction with another analysis of the overall sustainable transport strategy of the city of Bogotá. So we are not considering just this MRT, but we wanted to highlight this case for this presentation. But we also have a report coming soon about the sustainable transport strategy, which involves the analysis of the past. So basically from 2010, what has been the changes in the transport modes and the transport system in Bogotá. And we have also one scenario when we consider only the past, and then when we consider the MRT system. So this is an exercise that has been going on, but it's not like a result that has been decisive for investing or not in the MRT, because this was already decided in a previous administration. What we are doing is basically to reinforce the idea that this is a system that will solve some issues in Bogotá, and highlighting what are the benefits and the avoided costs from a different perspective, because in their analysis, they consider mostly traditional indicators. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Natalia. There is one aspect we noticed when we started working on the project, or actually when we had to identify what projects to work on, that was pretty striking to me, meaning that Bogotá had received prizes for how good the sustainable transport strategy was in the past 20 years. But when we started looking at an evaluation of the success and effectiveness of the strategy, we could not find anything. And so in principle, it was very ambitious, very forward-looking, but then in practice, there was that lack of evidence. And so that's what, in a way, brought us to say, let's apply the SAVI methodology to that context. Let's try to put a dollar value onto the many benefits that are being discussed, but they're not quantified yet. So this was actually a drive for us to fill a knowledge gap, with the hope that then it would inform the discussion. And in our experience, there are certain projects where the missing piece of the puzzle is the economic analysis with the CBA or the financial assessment. And so there is a lot of interest in collaborating with a team like ours to provide that information that is needed. While in other cases, there is a bit of reluctance because there is less appreciation for the value that this systemic analysis would provide. And so this is where we develop the report and we share it, we give presentations, we go to workshops and so on and so forth. Hopefully that it raises attention and it's being picked up in the discourse. Then if it informs the conversation on sustainable investments and it doesn't involve us, it doesn't matter. As long as it serves the purpose of informing discussions, that's what we want to achieve. Now, there are other questions, and Natalia, I'll point to the next one. And this one says, some avoided costs are only affecting government spending, such as the health impacts. Does that encourage the government to subsidize or partner with the developer, let's say, to bring the project to fruition? What do you think? So how is that multi-stakeholder approach we apply supporting decision-making in your view?
Yes, so yeah, the ideal situation will be that the different stakeholders and decision makers take into account not only what affects them, but what affects the entire situation. In the case of the government, the health impacts, the reduction in health expenditure will definitely benefit them, and it is kind of in our hands. We try to do what's possible to highlight that benefit, but of course the decision will depend on their analysis, on their perceptions, but it is aimed to inform and to give tools for them to decide what to invest on. And sometimes it is very important when we do a comparison between, for instance, a sustainable and a non-sustainable infrastructure. It highlights even more the importance of investing in this type of sustainable solutions. So yeah, the idea is that the different stakeholders will identify these externalities and will understand what that means for their budget. For instance, for people, it also helps in time saved. So it is important that every stakeholder and every beneficiary of this assessment recognizes that is the benefit. And in our reports, we try to tailor more and more the messages to these stakeholders to inform the decisions. More than informing, of course, it's out of our hands, but hopefully this helps as a tool for deciding.
Yeah, thanks, Natalia. It is a very good point. And if you have an interest in reviewing some of the other reports we have prepared, also beyond transport, we normally have, at the end of the executive summary, a short table that indicates value for decision makers, value for the private sector, and value for households, to tease out what are the key messages for each of these stakeholder groups. And just last week with Michael, we were working on the subsidy policy for electric vehicles in India. And we were discussing breaking down the benefit to cost ratio for the government to see what is the return on investment or return on providing an incentive for the government alone, to see what would be the range of values that would make them, say, more motivated to extend this subsidy policy into the future and not stop it at this point in time at the end of the year. So we do try and put on the hat that is sometimes the government hat, the private sector hat, the household hat, to make sure that every group has an entry point to support the project, because there are some benefits to realize using these different points of view. Good. I don't see any other question in the chat. I was busy and happy to type in answers as much as I could during the presentations, so I hope that this is helpful. Given that we are only 5 minutes away from the end of the session, I would suggest to go to the next slide. Thank you, Michael, for that, or Natalia, just to fill in the survey. So we would very much welcome your input on how this went, what you liked and appreciated, what we can improve, so that we can keep improving our work and develop materials that are interesting and useful. Now, while you look at the link, it's also in the chat, by the way, to make it easier for you to access the survey. I would just provide a quick summary of what we have explored today in this session, also in relation to what we have seen in the first 2 sessions. So today we went into more of a deep dive into how we bring all the pieces of the analysis together. As we indicated, we work with social, economic, and environmental indicators. For better or worse, investment decisions are based on economic and financial performance. And so the CBA, cost-benefit analysis, is the tool we use to package these social, economic, and environmental indicators with the use of the economic valuation of social and environmental indicators into one single analysis. You may be aware that there are different methods. Cost-benefit analysis is not the only one. We have multi-criteria analysis, for instance, where some indicators are hard to quantify. But we are doing our best to make multi-criteria analysis redundant, because we want to try and make that economic valuation as much as possible. Of course, when it's relevant and when it's useful. But we want to make sure that we have all the cards being put on the table, and so there is no room for misinterpretation of the results, let's say. We have explored the use of the CBA, how it can be extended into project finance analysis, figuring out what may be, based on the amount of revenues, avoided costs, tangible and intangible, the best financial structuring for the project. What could be the portion of capital investment? What could be the portion of a loan? What could be the group of stakeholders that come in and become investors? That was the last part of Michael's presentation. And then we went into the case study of the MRT project for Bogotá, which is a great case in my view, because in fact, it shows that if you exclude all these intangible benefits and avoided costs, the so-called externalities, then it seems like it's a very expensive project that doesn't generate a lot of value. Unfortunately, it's almost the same for all the other transport projects. I'm yet to find a highway project with a very specific assessment that shows that it is economically viable. Normally, highways and similar projects and new airports and so on are being implemented because there is that notion that it provides access to market. It generates economic growth by providing access, but it's very difficult to quantify these impacts. So hopefully with our assessments, as you've seen from the first session on what is sustainable transport and why we developed the sustainable asset valuation, on to the second one with the use of systems thinking and system dynamics, so these more comprehensive methodologies, you see the rationale for embedding all social, economic, and environmental indicators in this analysis. Because we don't only want to bring access to a service, connect people to services and markets, we want to make sure that the investment is sustainable. Because investments in infrastructure, including transport, are enabling conditions for development, but we want it to be enabling conditions for sustainable development. So with this, thank you very much for your attention. I really enjoyed joining this session and have a more active role compared to the first two. If you have any specific requests, if you want to follow up, you see Michael's email here on this last slide. Feel free to reach out to him, contact us. He will certainly circulate this information to all of us in the team. And you also see the email in the chat. Thank you, Becca, for helping as well with all the prompt communication in the chat and having all the materials ready as I speak. So once again, thank you very much for joining these 3 sessions. And we wish you a good continuation of your day and hope to be in touch very soon. And of course, thank you, Michael and Natalia, also for having a very active role, both today and Michael, throughout the 3 sessions. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.